It was a bright morning, with the kind of sun that made the leaves glisten like tiny pieces of glass. Birds chirped softly, and the faint smell of dew on freshly cut grass filled the air. The homeowner stepped out onto his porch, taking a slow, deep breath, enjoying the peace of his land. It was the kind of morning that made him thankful for the small joys in life, the ones people often overlook when they rush through their days. He had worked hard to make his property a place of comfort and freedom, a place where he could be himself without unnecessary interruptions. For years, he had dealt with the local homeowners association. Most of the time, it had been manageable. Notices came in the mail, sometimes a polite reminder about rules, and other times, a little push to maintain appearances or follow certain standards. He had always complied, carefully keeping his property in order, making sure everything was clean and presentable, yet he had learned to navigate their bureaucracy with a cautious patience. He understood that authority figures could sometimes overstep, but he also believed in staying calm, keeping documentation, and knowing his rights. That morning, as he sipped a cup of coffee on the porch, his attention was drawn to an unfamiliar vehicle slowly approaching. It was a small patrol car, marked with the HOA logo. He squinted through the sunlight, trying to get a better look. The car seemed out of place. It rolled over the gravel path leading directly onto his property, moving in a way that suggested they assumed they had permission, whether or not that was true. His stomach sank a little, and a sense of unease crept over him. He set his coffee down and watched carefully, noting the faces inside the vehicle, the papers in their hands, and the deliberate, almost commanding way they drove forward. His first instinct was disbelief. He had always known the HOA could be strict, but he had never imagined they would just enter his property without asking. He stepped off the porch slowly, careful not to make sudden movements, and called out a simple, polite greeting. The car did not slow. The occupants did not acknowledge him. Instead, they parked briefly near the edge of his lawn, their presence loud and intrusive in the otherwise quiet morning. It felt like an invasion, a disruption of something sacred and private. He walked toward the patrol car, maintaining a calm demeanor, even though his heart was racing. He reminded himself that keeping composure was essential in moments like this. The two patrol officers stepped out, clipboards in hand, and approached him with a mix of confidence and irritation. One of them spoke first, a tone that tried to sound authoritative, almost like they owned the land. They asked a series of questions that seemed rehearsed. Questions about compliance, about landscaping, about the upkeep of certain areas that, frankly, belonged entirely to him. He answered carefully, calmly, keeping his voice even. He explained that the property was private, that he had records proving his ownership, and that they were not allowed to be there without explicit permission. The officers listened, but did not seem convinced. Instead, they leaned in closer, gesturing to areas they had no right to inspect, asking again, almost impatiently, as if his words were secondary to their assumed power. Around him, the neighborhood was waking up. A few neighbors peeked from behind curtains or from across the street, curious and concerned. The homeowner could sense their eyes on him, felt their silent support, yet also the tension of the unknown. How far would these officers go? Would they respect boundaries, or would they push their assumed authority to the limit? He reminded himself that this was his property, that his rights were protected, and that patience and documentation were his allies. Minutes stretched, each one heavier than the last. The officers moved slowly, checking edges of his lawn, leaning over fences, peering at structures, taking notes on their clipboards. Every movement felt calculated, deliberate. The homeowner stayed close, asking questions, challenging their presence politely but firmly. He spoke clearly, not raising his voice, but making it undeniable that they were crossing a line. Yet, despite his calm, the officers pressed on, confident, almost cocky, as if they believed the rules of ownership could be bent at their whim. He took out his phone discreetly and began recording. Each word, each action, each gesture from the officers was documented. He knew that proof was essential in situations like this. He also called his attorney, explaining the scenario calmly, making sure that someone else was aware of the unfolding events. While the HOA officers acted as though they had the upper hand, he felt a growing sense of clarity. He could see the situation for what it was, a confrontation. Yes, but one that he could manage through careful steps. Legal knowledge, and patience. The tension thickened as the officers moved closer to a small section of his property where he kept personal equipment. A place that was clearly marked and restricted. He stepped in front of them, his posture calm but firm. He explained once again that this was private property, that they had no right to enter, and that he would not allow them to touch or inspect these items. The officers paused, slightly taken aback by his assertiveness. For a moment there was silence, broken only by the chirping of birds and the faint rustling of leaves in the morning breeze. In those quiet moments, he reflected on the years he had spent maintaining this property. Every tree planted, every fence erected, every small detail had been a labor of love and patience. And here were strangers, claiming authority, threatening to undermine the sanctity of what he had built. He felt a surge of determination. He would not be intimidated. He would not allow the sanctity of his home and property to be compromised by unchecked authority. Yet he also knew that rash actions could escalate the situation dangerously. Patience, documentation, and calm communication were his allies. He spoke again, explaining the legal boundaries, citing local property laws as clearly and calmly as he could. The officers muttered among themselves, clearly frustrated. They wrote notes on their clipboards, perhaps reassessing their approach, but still lingered, still occupying the space that belonged to him. He took deep breaths, maintaining his composure, making sure that his tone remained firm, yet respectful. He was conscious of the neighbors watching, of the importance of not giving in to fear or anger. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. The sun climbed higher in the sky, but the homeowner remained vigilant. Every gesture, every word, every movement from the officers was noted, both mentally and digitally. He knew that this documentation could become critical if the situation escalated further. He also knew that his calm presence was a silent message. He was in control of his property, and he would not allow it to be taken lightly. Eventually, after several tense minutes, the homeowner decided to call the sheriff. It was a simple phone call, but it marked a turning point. He explained the situation clearly and calmly, providing the location and describing the officer's actions. He remained on the porch, phone in hand, his posture steady, his eyes fixed on the patrol car. The sense of anticipation grew, but he stayed composed. Knowing that he had taken the correct steps, while waiting for the sheriff, he continued to engage with the HOA officers, asking questions, pointing out boundaries, asserting his rights politely but firmly. They responded with irritation, their confidence wavering slightly as the reality of potential legal consequences became clearer. The tension in the air was palpable, a mixture of confrontation, disbelief, and quiet observation. Neighbors began to step outside, some walking closer, some observing from a distance. The homeowner welcomed their silent support, feeling strengthened by the quiet presence of those who understood the importance of standing one's ground. He continued to document every detail, every movement, making sure that the evidence would be complete, that there would be no doubt about what had transpired. As the minutes passed, the patrol officers began to shift uncomfortably. They glanced at one another, perhaps reconsidering their approach, sensing that their assumed authority was being challenged. The homeowner remained calm, steady, unwavering. His voice was firm but polite, his tone clear, his posture confident. He did not allow fear or anger to dictate his actions. He remained rooted in the knowledge that he was right, that his property was private, and that legal authority was on his side by the time the sheriff arrived. The homeowner had not moved, had not given in, and had maintained complete control over his demeanor and actions. The patrol officers turned to face the new arrival, and the atmosphere shifted instantly. The homeowner, still calm and composed, knew that the next moments would define the resolution of this confrontation. He had prepared himself, both mentally and legally, for this moment, and he was ready to assert his rights fully. Through the early tension, the quiet determination of the homeowner had set the stage for what was to come. He had maintained composure in the face of intrusion, had documented every detail, had reached out for legal support, and had remained patient and observant. The morning had started peacefully, but it had become a test of authority, rights, and patience. The homeowner had shown that calm resolve, knowledge of the law, and a measured response were powerful tools when facing overreach. The stage was set for the sheriff's intervention, and the homeowner stood ready, unwavering, on his property. A testament to quiet strength and careful preparation. Homeowner could feel his heartbeat steadying. After the initial shock of seeing the HOA patrol on his property, he had faced difficult situations before, but nothing quite like this. He knew that staying calm was essential, but he also knew that the officers were testing him, testing the boundaries of authority and the limits of his patience. Their movements were deliberate, confident, and designed to provoke a reaction. They walked around inspecting areas they had no right to, taking notes and speaking in tones meant to intimidate. Each step they took across his land felt invasive, and he reminded himself not to let their behavior dictate his own. He had his phone out, recording the entire encounter discreetly. Every word, every gesture, every note they made was being documented. He knew that in situations like this, proof was crucial. He also kept a mental note of each step, making sure he remembered details that could later serve as evidence. The HOA officers seemed unaware of how carefully he was observing them, thinking their position made them untouchable. But he understood that authority, when misused, could be challenged, and he was determined to do so without escalating the conflict. One of the officers stepped closer to a garden area, pointing out that a few plants were not aligned according to the HOA guidelines. He tried to explain politely that this section of the property was personal, that the rules did not apply to him in this context. But the officer waved him off, claiming it was part of a larger compliance check. The homeowner realized they were not listening to reason. They were following a script, a rigid approach that assumed their authority was absolute. He knew that arguments alone would not resolve the situation. So he continued to maintain a calm demeanor while documenting everything meticulously as the officers moved toward the driveway. He noticed a few neighbors stepping out of their homes, curious and concerned. Some stood across the street, peeking cautiously from behind curtains or fences, while others came closer to watch from a safe distance. The homeowner appreciated their quiet support, even though he had not asked for it. Their presence made him feel less isolated, reminded him that what was happening was unusual and significant. He kept his focus on the officers, speaking clearly and firmly, asserting his rights without anger or sarcasm. The tension escalated when one officer suggested they needed to inspect a small shed near the back of the property. This shed contained personal items and equipment, some of which were sensitive and expensive. The homeowner immediately stepped in front, calmly but firmly stating that they were not allowed inside. The officers argued briefly, insisting it was part of their inspection, but he held his ground. He knew that physical confrontation would be dangerous and unnecessary. Instead, he relied on the power of words, legal knowledge, and calm composure. The homeowner noticed that the officers were becoming slightly frustrated. Their confident, almost arrogant posture wavered as he continued to challenge them with calm, rational statements. He cited property laws and explained the limits of their authority. They scribbled notes on their clipboards, perhaps reconsidering their approach, but they did not leave. He could see that the situation was delicate. One wrong move could escalate it beyond what was necessary. He remained aware of this, careful to maintain a balance between assertiveness and calm. He continued to speak directly to the officers, keeping his tone steady. He reminded them that the property boundaries were clearly marked, that he had all documentation to prove ownership, and that they were trespassing. Despite this, they continued to linger, inspecting areas that were strictly private. The homeowner felt the weight of the moment. He realized that this confrontation was about more than just the HOA rules. It was about respect, rights, and personal space. He had to navigate it carefully to ensure his message was heard without giving them any excuse to escalate. While the officers continued their inspections, he began to prepare for the next step. He had already contacted his attorney, but he also knew that involving law enforcement directly would be necessary if they refused to leave. He kept his phone close, ready to call the sheriff again if needed. Each time he glanced at the officers, he assessed their behavior, noting any signs of aggression or hesitation. It became clear that their confidence was beginning to crack, that they were not as invincible as they had assumed. The neighbors watched quietly, some whispering among themselves, others simply observing. He could feel their silent support, and it gave him strength. He knew that standing up to overreach was not always easy, and having witnesses helped reinforce the legitimacy of his actions. He remained polite and composed, even when the officers' words grew sharper, their tone more commanding. He refused to respond with anger, understanding that losing composure could undermine his position. Minutes passed with the officers moving slowly across the property, inspecting, questioning, and taking notes. He continued to document everything, capturing video and photos discreetly. He spoke calmly, answering questions without revealing frustration, maintaining a steady and confident presence. Each time they tried to challenge him, he responded with clear, firm statements about his rights and the limits of their authority. It was a test of patience, one that he knew he had to pass in order to ensure a safe and just resolution. At one point, an officer stepped closer to the house itself. Examining the exterior walls and the landscaping immediately around the foundation, the homeowner stepped forward, explaining clearly that the house and surrounding area were private, that their inspection was not authorized, and that continued presence without permission could be considered trespassing. The officer hesitated for a moment, seemingly weighing his words, but continued to make notes. The homeowner remained calm, his body language assertive but non-threatening. He knew that control over his own demeanor was critical to prevent escalation. He noticed a few minor mistakes in the officers' documentation and quietly made note of them, aware that any inaccuracies could be useful later. He remained focused on the larger picture, understanding that the confrontation was about more than a single inspection. It was about asserting and maintaining his rights while ensuring safety. His calm persistence began to create a subtle shift. The officers' movements slowed, their gestures less confident, their tone slightly less commanding. He sensed that they were beginning to recognize the limits of their authority, even if they were reluctant to admit it, as the confrontation continued. He took a moment to speak to one of the neighbors who had come closer. He explained briefly that everything was under control, that he was documenting everything and had contacted both legal counsel and law enforcement. The neighbor nodded, impressed by his calm approach and careful planning. This quiet interaction reinforced his resolve. He realized that staying composed and measured was not just about protecting property. It was about demonstrating integrity and leadership in a tense situation. The homeowner returned his attention fully to the officers. He spoke again, calmly reiterating that they had no right to enter the shed, no right to inspect certain areas, and no authority to make any unilateral decisions about his property. The officers muttered among themselves, glancing at each other, perhaps questioning their own assumptions. His calm and measured approach had begun to unsettle them, challenging their perception of control. The balance of power, though delicate, was shifting subtly in his favor. He continued documenting, taking careful notes, recording videos, and photographing key moments. He knew that this evidence could be vital if the situation escalated further. Yet, despite the tension, he maintained a composed, human-centered approach. His goal was not confrontation for its own sake, but the protection of his property, his rights, and the respect he deserved. He refused to let fear or anger dictate his actions, understanding that composure was both a shield and a weapon in moments like this. By late morning, the situation had become a quiet standoff. The HOA officers were still on his property, but their movements were slower, less assured. He continued to assert his boundaries politely but firmly, ensuring they understood the limits of their authority. Neighbors remained nearby, observing silently, adding to the unspoken pressure on the officers. The homeowner felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. He had maintained control, documented everything, and remained calm in the face of provocation. As he waited for further assistance from law enforcement, he reflected on the importance of preparation, knowledge, and patience. He understood that standing up to overreach required more than anger or frustration. It required strategy, awareness, and the ability to remain composed under pressure. The officers were still present, still testing boundaries, but the homeowner felt increasingly confident that the situation was moving toward a resolution in his favor. Every detail, every gesture, every word was carefully recorded, not just for legal purposes, but as a testament to his ability to navigate a difficult and tense scenario with integrity and calm. He remained vigilant, ready for any escalation, yet fully aware that his measured approach was the key to maintaining safety and asserting his rights. The morning that began as peaceful had turned into a challenge of authority, patience, and composure, and the homeowner had met it with quiet determination. Hours passed, and the situation remained tense but controlled. The homeowner continued to document, engage politely but firmly, and assert his rights. The officers' confidence continued to waver, their authority challenged not by aggression but by calm, meticulous, and unwavering composure. The neighbors watched, witnessing a quiet demonstration of courage and knowledge in the face of overreach. The stage was set for the next steps, and the homeowner remained prepared, steadfast, and composed, ready to see the situation through to its rightful resolution. The homeowner continued to watch the HOA officers moving slowly across his property, their gestures and conversations increasingly hesitant. The early confidence they had displayed seemed to be fading, replaced by uncertainty. He stayed calm, maintaining a polite and firm tone, aware that any sign of frustration or aggression could escalate the situation. He reminded himself that the goal was not confrontation, but the protection of his property and his rights. He kept his phone close, recording every action and every word, knowing that clear evidence would be crucial. Every movement of the officers, every glance, every note they wrote on their clipboards was captured. He spoke softly but firmly, reiterating that the property was private. Boundaries were clearly marked, and their presence was unauthorized. The officers muttered among themselves, occasionally exchanging brief glances, and he sensed that their composure was weakening. In the distance, the sound of a siren reached his ears. He looked up, feeling a surge of hope and relief. It was the sheriff. He had called hours ago, and now help was arriving. The patrol officers noticed the vehicle too, and a flicker of concern crossed their faces. Their movement slowed even more, and for the first time, they appeared unsure of how to proceed. The homeowner stayed where he was, hands visible, calm, and composed, ready to speak to the sheriff and explain the situation clearly. When the sheriff arrived and stepped out of his vehicle, there was an immediate shift in the atmosphere. The homeowner approached respectfully, explaining the events in a clear, factual manner. He described the HOA officers' uninvited entry onto his property, their inspection of areas they had no right to enter, and their threats of fines and warnings. He presented his property documents, pointing out the clearly defined boundaries and the legal protections that applied. The sheriff listened attentively, nodding and taking notes, assessing the situation carefully. The HOA officers tried to speak, attempting to assert their authority even in the presence of the sheriff. They spoke quickly, trying to justify their actions. But the homeowner remained calm, answering questions clearly and concisely. He explained that the property was private, that they were not authorized to be there, and that any continued intrusion could have legal consequences. The sheriff's presence added weight to his words, and he could see the officer's confident demeanor begin to waver. The sheriff began to ask the HOA officers questions. He spoke in a firm, authoritative tone, making it clear that he was in control of the situation. The officers tried to explain their actions, citing guidelines and inspections, but the sheriff's questions highlighted the limits of their authority. He asked whether they had explicit permission to enter the property, whether they had legal documentation, and whether their actions complied with state law. The officers hesitated, realizing that they could not provide clear answers, as the sheriff continued to speak. The homeowner remained calm, observing carefully. He noted the subtle signs of stress and uncertainty in the officer's posture and tone. Their clipboards, once a symbol of authority, now seemed ineffective. The sheriff explained the law clearly, stating that entering private property without permission was not allowed, and that continued intrusion could lead to legal consequences. The homeowner felt a sense of quiet satisfaction, knowing that patience, documentation, and composure were paying off. Neighbors began to gather at a safe distance, watching the interaction unfold. Some whispered among themselves, while others simply observed, captivated by the shift in power dynamics. The homeowner's calm and respectful approach had made a strong impression on those watching. It was clear that he had handled the situation with intelligence and patience, relying on knowledge and composure rather than confrontation or anger. The HOA officers exchanged glances. Realizing that their position was weakening, they tried to argue their case, but the sheriff's authority was clear and their excuses fell flat. The homeowner continued to provide factual information, responding to questions politely but firmly. He explained that he had documented every step, recorded every interaction, and contacted legal counsel in advance. This preparation reinforced his position, making it difficult for the officers to challenge him effectively. The sheriff took a moment to review the homeowner's documentation, checking property boundaries and legal records. He confirmed that the homeowner's claims were accurate and that the HOA officers had overstepped their authority. He addressed the officers directly, making it clear that their presence was unauthorized and that they needed to leave immediately. The officers complied, reluctantly retreating from the property. Their previous confidence replaced by a subdued and uneasy demeanor as the officers departed. The sheriff turned to the homeowner and spoke reassuringly. He explained that he had witnessed the situation firsthand, that the homeowner had acted correctly, and that he had every right to protect his property. The homeowner felt a sense of relief, mixed with pride. He had remained composed throughout the ordeal, relied on knowledge and preparation, and successfully defended his rights without confrontation. The sheriff stayed for a few more minutes, ensuring that the officers had fully left the property and that no further incidents were likely. He offered additional advice, reminding the homeowner to continue documenting any future interactions with the HOA and to remain aware of his rights. The homeowner thanked him, appreciating both the legal clarity and the reassurance. The presence of law enforcement had shifted the balance completely, validating his approach and providing a clear resolution to the immediate threat. Neighbors continued to observe from a distance, some approaching cautiously to offer quiet congratulations. The homeowner remained humble and composed, explaining the importance of calm and careful handling of such situations. He emphasized that patience, preparation, and knowledge of the law were more effective than anger or confrontation. His example left a strong impression on those who had witnessed the events, reinforcing the value of measured and intelligent responses to overreach. As the sheriff left, the homeowner walked slowly across his property, checking boundaries and reviewing the areas that had been inspected. He felt a renewed sense of control and security. The morning's tension had been intense, but it had also demonstrated the effectiveness of patience, documentation, and calm resolve. He reflected on the lessons learned, understanding that authority could be challenged respectfully and effectively when armed with knowledge and composure. The neighborhood slowly returned to its usual quiet rhythm. But the homeowner knew that the events of the morning would not be forgotten. Word of the sheriff's intervention and the HOA officers' retreat would likely spread, reinforcing the importance of respecting private property and legal boundaries. The homeowner felt a sense of satisfaction, not in confrontation, but in the successful assertion of rights through patience, preparation, and calm authority. He spent the rest of the day documenting the incident in detail, reviewing recordings and notes, and organizing the information for potential future reference. Every word, gesture, and action had been captured, providing a comprehensive record of the events. He also spoke quietly with a few neighbors who had watched, explaining the importance of knowing one's rights and handling conflicts calmly and intelligently. His approach had turned a tense confrontation into a demonstration of responsible and effective problem-solving, even as evening approached. The homeowner continued to reflect on the morning. The arrival of the sheriff had been a turning point, but it had been his preparation, composure, and careful documentation that had made the intervention effective. He felt a quiet pride in his ability to manage the situation without anger, aggression, or rash decisions. He understood that such situations required patience, clarity, and a calm demeanor. He had successfully applied these principles. As he looked around his property, he felt a renewed sense of peace. The HOA officers had left, the sheriff had validated his actions, and his property was secure. The morning had started with tension and uncertainty, but it had ended with clarity, respect, and a reaffirmation of his rights. He understood that challenges like these were part of life, but that careful preparation and calm, intelligent responses could turn potential conflicts into victories. He felt confident that he could handle similar situations in the future. Knowing the importance of patience, documentation, and the support of law enforcement when necessary, the homeowner spent the rest of the evening in quiet reflection. Appreciating the calm that had returned to his property, he reviewed every step of the morning, noting what had worked well and what could be improved. He understood that knowledge and preparation were powerful tools, and that staying composed under pressure was essential. The events of the morning had tested his patience, his resolve, and his ability to manage conflict. But he had emerged stronger, wiser, and more confident in his ability to protect what was rightfully his. By nightfall, the tension had lifted completely. The homeowner felt a deep sense of relief and satisfaction. He had handled the situation responsibly, protected his property, and demonstrated that authority, when misused, could be challenged effectively and respectfully. He had turned a potentially stressful and confrontational situation into an example of patience, preparation, and calm resolve. The events of the day would remain a powerful reminder of the importance of standing firm, knowing one's rights, and handling challenges with intelligence and composure. The next morning began quietly, with the homeowner walking through his property, ensuring that everything was in order. The events of the previous day still lingered in his mind, but the tension had lifted significantly. He had reflected on the confrontation with the HOA patrol, the arrival of the sheriff, and the way calm and careful action had resolved the situation. Yet he remained vigilant, aware that the HOA might test boundaries again. Preparation and awareness were now more important than ever as he went about his morning tasks. He noticed the neighbors emerging from their homes. Some waved quietly, offering smiles of support. A few approached him, expressing concern and curiosity about the previous day's events. He explained calmly, emphasizing the importance of remaining composed, documenting actions, and knowing one's rights. His words carried weight because they were backed by experience, preparation, and clear evidence of the events that had unfolded. Later that morning, the sheriff returned briefly to check in. He walked with the homeowner across the property, reviewing boundaries and discussing the legal aspects of the situation. The sheriff explained that while the HOA had the right to enforce certain rules, they had no authority to trespass without permission. He reinforced the homeowner's understanding of the law, emphasizing the importance of clear communication, documentation, and measured responses. The homeowner felt reassured, knowing that he had the support of law enforcement and a clear understanding of his legal protections. The HOA patrol had not returned yet, and it was clear that the sheriff's intervention had shifted the balance. However, the homeowner knew that authority figures sometimes tested limits repeatedly. He continued to document his property carefully, making notes of boundaries, security measures, and interactions with anyone associated with the HOA. He remained observant, watching for signs of potential overreach or attempts to provoke a reaction. Patience and awareness were now his allies, as important as ever. During the morning, the homeowner noticed the HOA sending a small team to the edge of the neighborhood, likely discussing the previous events. He observed from a distance, noting their gestures and conversation. It was clear that the sheriff's presence had left an impression, and they were reconsidering their approach. The homeowner remained calm, resisting any urge to confront them prematurely. He understood that escalation without cause could be risky, that patience and careful planning were essential. Around midday, the homeowner decided to walk along the perimeter of his property. He inspected fences, gates, and markers, ensuring that everything was clearly defined and well maintained. Clear boundaries were crucial, both for personal security and for legal protection. He documented each section with photographs, videos, and notes, making sure that any future disputes would have clear evidence. This preparation gave him a sense of control, Reducing anxiety and reinforcing his confidence in handling potential challenges, neighbors continued to observe, offering quiet support from their yards or across the street. The homeowner appreciated their presence, understanding that while they were not directly involved, their awareness of the situation provided a sense of community and safety. He spoke with a few, sharing insights about calm and strategic responses to authority overreach. His advice was grounded in real experience, emphasizing patience, preparation, and the importance of documenting every action. As the afternoon approached, the HOA patrol approached the property again, this time cautiously. They stayed at a distance initially, as if aware that the previous day's events had shifted the dynamic. The homeowner watched carefully, noting their behavior, their gestures, and the way they moved. He maintained a calm demeanor, ready to respond, but choosing not to engage immediately. Observation and documentation were key. He continued recording discreetly, capturing every detail of the patrol's presence. The HOA officers attempted to make contact, speaking from a safe distance. They inquired about rules and compliance, trying to assert authority without crossing into trespassing. The homeowner responded politely but firmly, reiterating the boundaries of his property and his rights. He maintained a respectful tone, ensuring that his words were clear, concise, and legally grounded. The officers seemed hesitant, aware that any misstep could lead to consequences. The shift in the power dynamic was evident. The homeowner's composure and preparation had made an impact. During this interaction, the sheriff remained nearby, observing quietly. His presence reinforced the homeowner's position, ensuring that the HOA officers understood the limits of their authority. The homeowner continued to explain the legal boundaries, referencing documentation and previous interactions. The officers muttered among themselves, clearly weighing the potential risks of overstepping again. The homeowner felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that calm, strategic action had once again maintained control over the situation. Later in the afternoon, the homeowner walked through his property, reflecting on the lessons learned. He understood that authority could be challenged respectfully and effectively when approached with preparation, knowledge, and composure. He reviewed his documentation, checked recording devices, and ensured that every interaction was logged. This meticulous attention to detail provided peace of mind and reinforced his confidence in handling any future encounters with the HOA neighbors. Continued to watch quietly, some approaching briefly to express their support. The homeowner remained humble and composed, emphasizing that the key to handling authority overreach was calm, measured responses, and careful documentation. His approach served as a model for others, demonstrating that patience and intelligence could achieve results without confrontation or aggression. As evening approached, the HOA patrol finally retreated from the neighborhood, leaving the homeowner's property undisturbed. The sheriff had provided guidance and oversight, ensuring that the officers understood their limits. The homeowner felt a profound sense of relief and accomplishment. He had maintained control, protected his property, demonstrated that calm, strategic action could effectively resolve conflict. The experience reinforced the importance of knowing one's rights, preparing thoroughly, and remaining composed under pressure. The homeowner spent the remainder of the evening reviewing every detail of the day. He organized photographs, videos, and notes, ensuring that all documentation was complete and accurate. He reflected on the interactions with neighbors, the HOA officers, and the sheriff, understanding the importance of communication, respect, and legal knowledge. The day had been challenging, but it had also been a powerful demonstration of how patience, preparation, and calm resolve could achieve a successful outcome. By nightfall, the property was quiet once more. The homeowner walked through the yard, appreciating the peace and order he had worked so hard to maintain. The HOA patrol had been stopped, boundaries had been reinforced, and the sheriff had provided clarity and support. The homeowner felt a sense of pride and confidence, knowing that he had handled the situation responsibly and effectively. He understood that the lessons learned would serve him well in the future, reinforcing the importance of preparation, documentation, and calm, intelligent responses to challenges. The day had tested his patience, his knowledge, and his composure. Yet through careful observation, respectful communication, and strategic planning, he had ensured that his property remained secure and his rights protected. The HOA patrol had been reminded of the limits of their authority. Neighbors had witnessed a clear example of calm and effective problem-solving, and the homeowner had emerged stronger and more confident. The experience reinforced the value of patience, preparation, and integrity, leaving the homeowner ready to face any future challenges with clarity and composure. The morning started like any other. But for the homeowner, it carried the quiet weight of reflection. The events of the past days had left a lasting impression, shaping not only how he viewed authority, but also how he valued preparation, composure, and clear communication. His property was calm now, serene in a way that contrasted sharply with the tension that had filled the air just days before. Yet, the lessons learned were vivid and meaningful, shaping his approach to life and interactions with the HOA and neighbors alike as he walked through his yard. But as small details he had taken for granted. The sunlight reflecting off the grass, the gentle rustling of leaves, and the sound of birdsong all reminded him of the simple joys of his property. This land, cultivated through years of effort, care, and attention, was more than a place to live. It was a testament to his dedication and to the importance of protecting what one has worked hard to build. The intrusion by the HOA patrol had been unsettling, but it also served as a reminder that vigilance and patience were necessary in safeguarding personal space and rights. He spent the morning reviewing every detail of the confrontations, watching the recordings he had made and reading over his notes. Each interaction, every word spoken, and every gesture had been captured. The homeowner reflected on how he had remained calm despite provocation, how he had relied on legal knowledge, documentation, and thoughtful communication to assert his rights. It was a practice in restraint and intelligence, a clear demonstration of how careful preparation could resolve conflict without aggression or anger. The sheriff's involvement had been pivotal, but it was the homeowner's composure and preparation that had made the intervention effective. He understood now that respect and patience could achieve more than confrontation ever could. Even when authorities seemed to overstep, measured responses and knowledge of legal boundaries could turn a tense situation into a controlled and favorable outcome. He appreciated the clarity the sheriff had provided and recognized the importance of law enforcement's presence in maintaining fairness and balance. As the afternoon approached, the homeowner decided to take a walk along the edges of his property. He inspected fences, gates, and boundary markers, ensuring everything was clearly defined and visible. These physical reminders were not just for legal protection, they also reinforced his confidence in his control over the property. Clear boundaries made it easy to communicate limits respectfully and effectively. He documented the inspection with photos and notes, understanding that evidence and preparation could prevent misunderstandings and potential disputes. Neighbors continued to watch from a distance, some curious and others quietly supportive. The homeowner acknowledged their presence with a nod or smile, appreciating their subtle encouragement. The neighborhood had become aware of the events. Their observations underscored the broader lesson of respect for personal property. While the homeowner had focused on the immediate threat, the situation had also provided an example to others about how calm, strategic action could successfully handle overreach.